today's speaker, Tim Huebner, the Sternberg Professor of History at Rhodes College in nearby Memphis. He's a specialist in the history of 19th century United States, the author most recently of a book called Liberty and Union, the Civil War Era and American Constitutionalism, but he's also written books on the Tawney Court, the Southern Judicial Tradition, and was co-editor with the late Kermit Hall of Major Problems in American Constitutional History. He's done op-ed pieces for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, the Wall Street Journal's Market Watch, the Weekly Standard, SCOTUS blog, and the New York Times. Professor Huebner is co-editor with Paul Finkelman, and these names may not mean much to you, but you can trust me, they're all top people in the field, of Southern Legal Studies, a book series published by the University of Georgia Press. And since 2010, he served under editor Melvin Urofsky as the associate editor of the Journal of the Supreme Court History, which is published 3 times a year by the Supreme Court Historical Society. He's been at Rhodes College since 1995, teaches courses on the history of the American South, U.S. constitutional history, and the Civil War and Reconstruction era. He founded and directed the Rhodes Institute for Regional Studies, later served for 6 years as the Department of History. In 2004, he received the Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Teaching, given annually to a member of the Rhodes faculty. And that same year, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education named him as Professor of the Year. Now, I have just one other thing to say about him, but before we do, because I'm afraid I'll forget it later, at the end of this lecture, we do have copies of his book for sale, and I believe he was certainly very obliging, didn't charge me any extra to have him sign mine, and I'm sure he'll do that for you. The book is $30, nice hardback, substantive book, Kansas Press, one of the best, and that includes the tax. And there will also, for those of you, and I've warned most of you, never get between food and Dean and food, but I don't plan to eat too much tonight, so if you get out there before I do, you'll probably have something to eat. So that'll immediately follow the lecture, and all of you are invited to attend that. So let's end by saying that Dr. Huebner is a native of Orlando. He's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of the University of Miami, earned his master's and PhD from the University of Florida, and lives in Memphis with his wife, Kristen, and their 2 children. So let's welcome Dr. Huebner here tonight.
drawing down the blessings of heaven upon this land. Now look at a couple of phrases there which I would argue are very significant. We beseech that as we are men. Jones is arguing that rights come from the fact that people are people, that I have rights as an individual, as a human being. Beseech that as we are men. And then also look at that phrase that he mentions unalienable rights, a hint probably having to do with, of course, the Declaration of Independence, claiming that these unalienable rights mentioned by Jefferson applied to all. Similarly, several years later, James Forten, another free black man in Philadelphia, publishes a volume called A Series of Letters by a Man of Color in 1813. And here, Forten goes even further than Jones. He puts it this way, quote, "We hold this truth to be self-evident, that God created all men equal is one of the most prominent features of the Declaration of Independence. And in that glorious fabric of collected wisdom, our noble Constitution. This idea embraces the Indian and the European, the savage and the saint, the Peruvian and the Laplander, the white man and the African. And whatever measures are adopted subversive of this estimable privilege are in direct violation of the letter and spirit of our Constitution," unquote. So understand what Forten is doing here in 1813. He's taking Jefferson and he's taking Absalom Jones and he's taking it one step further, arguing, yes, that soaring rhetoric from Jefferson's Declaration applies to all. And he even actually lists several groups in order to make this point that we're not simply speaking of men, we're speaking of men of all races. He's expanding in some ways the language of Thomas Jefferson, right? Well, what happens subsequently, starting in 1830, is that African Americans start to gather in conventions in the North, in places like Philadelphia. In fact, the first one of these gatherings was at the Bethel Church in Philadelphia, where a significant number of African Americans who were anti-slavery and who were also interested in trying to promote the rights of free blacks gathered in order to argue over these issues. And then they issued a statement, and other groups followed over the next several years. This was the beginning of what's called the Black Convention movement, starting in Philadelphia in 1830. And if we look at these documents, which are formulated over a period of several years, what we see is, once again, this whole notion of black constitutionalism, this unique understanding of the founding, which is crafted by black activists in the early 19th century. And it focused basically on three things. It focused on Thomas Jefferson's Declaration, this whole claim that all men are created equal. It also focused, going back to some of the ambiguity in the text of the Constitution, it focused on the fact that if you look at the Constitution closely in terms of slavery, although the Constitution seemed to recognize the existence of slavery, it never actually used the word slave or slavery. Instead, in every instance, it used persons in an awkward way, persons held in service to labor. But the fact that it used persons was an opening. It was a way that these activists in the early 19th century started to build an argument that the founding text actually supported an anti-slavery position. So Jefferson's claim that all men are created equal. Second, the fact that the Constitution never actually used the word slave, but always person. And finally, Christian theology of this whole notion of the brotherhood of all under the fatherhood of God. And that's how they talked about this in the 1830s as they were gathering and formulating these statements. And so this is what I call black constitutionalism. And this whole notion then was built up and it was formulated then in a series of meetings in churches, in Masonic organizations, and it was put forth in sermons and petitions and all sorts of letters and articles and speeches which were made in the antebellum North in the 1830s and 1840s. Now understand that this way of thinking, this black constitutional argument, existed on the margins. So this is not part of mainstream political thought in the 1830s and 1840s. Because actually, if we look what is going on in national politics, especially in the 1840s and 1850s, there's an argument not over the rights of black people, but over the rights of slaveholders. Now, this is a difficult concept for us to stomach, this notion that slaveholders had rights. But this is how white Southerners and most other whites understood things in the 1830s and 1840s. They argued in terms of slaveholders having a bundle of rights associated with their ownership of slave property. And so in the 1840s, they were arguing over how many rights did Southern slaveholders have to recapture fugitive slaves who escaped into the North? Or did Southern slaveholders have the right to carry their slave property into the territories of the West? So in the mainstream sort of national political situation of the 1840s, they're arguing not over the rights of slaves, but over the rights of slaveholders. And finally, ultimately, by the 1850s, these issues start to come into the courts. And as you probably already know, in 1857, this issue of slaveholders' rights comes to the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, in probably the most infamous ruling in the history of the United States, the Dred Scott case, issues his view on this question of the rights of slaveholders. And let's see what he says, right? He says, on the issue of black citizenship first, he says, they had for more than a century before been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. Now, there's a lot to talk about there, and maybe we'll save that for the question and answer period. But the main point that I want you to understand now is that Taney is totally squelching any concept at all of black citizenship for either slaves or free blacks. Blacks have no rights, he's arguing, that white people are bound to respect. At the same time, slaveholders have absolute rights. And Taney puts it this way in a summary statement of a very lengthy opinion. He says, quote, the right of property in a slave is distinctly and expressly affirmed in the Constitution. Now, we can argue about that too, maybe in questions and answers. Perhaps we can come back to that also. But the point here that I want you to understand is that by 1857, the political order, ultimately through the Supreme Court, is ruling that African Americans have no rights, slaveholders, seemingly, according to Chief Justice Taney, have absolute rights. Now, it's worth noting that up until that point, in the 70 or so odd year history of the Supreme Court, from its founding until 1857, this was the first time that the court had ever struck down a federal law as violating rights. And it did so in order to basically strike down a law as violating the rights of slave holders. So that's where things stood in terms of rights in 1857 in Dred Scott. Now, of course, in the next year, 1858, the year right after this ruling, Lincoln and Douglas are running for the Senate in the state of Illinois, and they're debating each other. And what are they debating? They're essentially debating the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott. They're arguing over whether the case was properly decided. Douglas was in favor of the court's ruling in Dred Scott. Of course, Lincoln was not. Lincoln was not in favor of the ruling because Lincoln didn't think that slaveholders' rights extended into Western territories. That was why he strongly disagreed with Chief Justice Taney. He did not think that slaveholders' rights, as understood by the court, were absolute. It's worth noting, though, that they're not arguing over black citizenship, that both Douglas and Lincoln were opposed to black citizenship in the state of Illinois. In other words, they're still mostly arguing over slaveholders' rights. But I want you to understand that even though that's what's happening in the mainstream, those voices from the margins are still being heard because African Americans did not simply accept Taney's ruling. They did not simply accept it. Listen to Charles Lennox Redmond in 1857, a few months after Taney's ruling. Shame on Judge Taney, he says. Shame on the U.S. Supreme Court. My God and Creator has given me rights which you are as much bound to respect as those of the whitest man among you, if I made the exhibitions of a man. And black men did make the exhibition of manhood at Bunker Hill and Lexington and Concord, as I can well testify. Similarly, the Convention of Colored Citizens of Massachusetts in 1857 argued that the Supreme Court's ruling in Dred Scott violated Article 4 of the Constitution, which had to do with the privileges and immunities of citizens. In other words, these free blacks in Massachusetts who had been citizens in the late 18th and early 19th century are arguing that the words of Roger Taney are not in keeping with the text of the Constitution. And finally, these words from the following year from a group of free blacks in New York. The Dred Scott decision is a foul and infamous lie, which neither black men nor white men are bound to respect. See how he's playing off Taney's language, right? We therefore call upon all who subscribe to the theory of human rights set forth in the Declaration of American Independence to trample in self-defense the dicta of Judge Taney beneath their feet as of no binding authority. Those of you who have studied law know that the word dicta here basically means that it's an extraneous sort of statement that doesn't really have to do with the legal issues at hand. And that's what this group is arguing Taney has done, that his ruling on black citizenship is mere dicta. It's extraneous language that doesn't really actually have any sort of a legal, doesn't have the force of law, right? So what's happening here then is black constitutionalists' notion of manhood, of freedom, and of citizenship remains in the background. It's still there, even though the Supreme Court had issued a ruling the year before in 1857. Now finally, I will simply say before I move into the second part of the talk that In 1859, the Supreme Court reaffirmed slaveholders' rights in a case called Abelman versus Booth. That case had to do with federal enforcement of the fugitive slave law, and what the Supreme Court does in that case is basically says that the full force and power of the federal government can and should be used to return fugitive slaves in the North to their Southern masters. So by 1859, the Supreme Court has held that all of the power of the federal government can and will be used to protect the rights of slaveholders. That's where things stood in 1859. Now, in 1860, of course, Abraham Lincoln is elected president. And from what Lincoln had said in the late 1850s, he was mildly anti-slavery. All that he had said was that he didn't think that slavery should spread into the West. In other words, he was challenging one of those rights of slaveholders that the Supreme Court had held was absolute. And since Abraham Lincoln won, 7 southern states of the Deep South, were fearful that slaveholders' rights would not be enforced under President Lincoln. And for that reason, then, they voted to withdraw from the Union. They tried to secede. Now understand this, and I've made this argument elsewhere. You can read about it on Real Clear History, but I would argue that secession was all about Southerners trying to protect slaveholders' rights, not states' rights. Slaveholders' rights. That's what they're worried about trying to hold on to. But at the same time that the southern states are seceding and Abraham Lincoln is coming into office, African Americans are already sensing an opening and an opportunity for freedom. An opportunity to turn this war into a war to bring about the end of slavery. Because even before the Civil War began, in the early months of 1861, a small group of African Americans will seek freedom at those federally occupied areas in the South, Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens, for example. And so from that early stage in 1861, we know that black constitutionalism lives. It's there in the background. And not is it and perhaps now war will help to push it into the forefront. And that's exactly what happens, because as early as January of 1862, John Rock, who was an African-American lawyer in the North, made the argument that really what needed to happen now was that African Americans needed to take up arms for the Union in order to turn this into a war to end slavery. Listen to his words. 75,000 freemen capable of bearing arms and 750,000 slaves wild with the enthusiasm caused by the dawn of the glorious opportunity of being able to strike a genuine blow for freedom will be a power that white men will be bound to respect. And you see, once again, playing off Tawny's language, right? Let the people of the U.S. do their duty and treat us as the people of all other nations treat us, as men. If they will do this, our last drop of blood is ready to be sacrificed in defense of the liberty of this country. But if you continue to deny us our rights and spurn our offers except as menials, colored men will be worse than fools to take up arms at all. So in wartime, early in the war, in January of 1862, folks like John Rock are already sensing an opportunity to turn this into a war for liberation. And not just for liberation, but as he says, for rights. Sensing that with freedom will come citizenship and rights. And not only sensing that, but pushing that, right? Well, it isn't until later in 1862 that Lincoln and Congress start to take action on these issues. So, for example, what happens in 1862 is Congress passes a series of laws. They overturn the Fugitive Slave Act. They ban slavery in the Western Territories. They end slavery in Washington, D.C. And finally, at the end of 1862, Abraham Lincoln indicates that he will issue a proclamation of emancipation, right? And what this does then is it speeds the exodus from southern plantations to federal military lines so that African Americans start to vote with their feet. They start to take matters into their own hands. They start to leave plantations, especially after Lincoln's proclamation in January of 1863. So what started as a trickle in the months before the Civil War, by early 1863, turned into a flood. And we see it from the words of a Union captain who's at Fortress Monroe, which is a Union-occupied area of Virginia. He says, "This is the rendezvous," speaking of formerly enslaved people who are now walking off plantations and heading toward that fort, right? They come here from all about, from Richmond and from 200 miles off in North Carolina. I have questioned a great many of them, and they do not feel much afraid. And there are a great many courageous fellows who have come from long distances in rebeldom. Some men who came here from North Carolina knew all about the proclamation, and they started on the belief in it, but they had heard these stories, and they wanted to know how it was, right? Black constitutionalism in action, not just at the high level of folks gathering and issuing statements, but as a grassroots movement of people claiming their freedom, walking off plantations, based on this notion that now the federal army is an army of liberation. And in the midst of this war then, in October of 1864, another convention, this one in Syracuse, where now as the war is starting to wind down and there's a sense that the Union is going to win and slavery is not going to survive, African Americans are working to ensure that freedom also means citizenship and rights. Not just freedom from bondage, but citizenship and rights. So at Syracuse in October of 1864, this is how the assembled delegates put it. 144 delegates, some from the north, some from the south, some from Washington, D.C. This is how they put it. Here we were born, or here were we born. For this country our fathers and our brothers have fought, and here we hope to remain in the full enjoyment of enfranchised manhood and its dignities. So do you see what's happened during wartime? What's happened during wartime is that black constitutionalism, which had been on the margins, now has been able to move into the mainstream because of the efforts of African Americans to take freedom into their own hands, because of the efforts of Abraham Lincoln and Congress to take some steps to interfere with slavery and slaveholders' rights. Finally, there's a mass exodus of African Americans from plantations, but it isn't simply an effort to try to claim freedom, it's an effort to try to claim citizenship and rights. The full enjoyment of enfranchised manhood and its dignities. What's happening here is that African Americans are helping to bring about a new discourse of rights. Once again, this is 1864. This is 7 years after Dred Scott. This is 7 years after they have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. 7 years after the idea that slaveholders' rights are absolute. And see how things have shifted so much during wartime. A profound shift. So finally then, as we move into Reconstruction, we can see how this shift takes shape in new understandings of citizenship, right? Now, of course, Lincoln lives to see the 13th Amendment passed in Congress, but he doesn't live to see its ultimate actual ratification by the states, which doesn't happen until December of 1865. And so it will be up to Andrew Johnson to secure the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Now, of course, we all know Andrew Johnson because he's one of the Tennessee presidents, right? Many people say he's also one of the worst presidents in the history of the United States. Maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer session. But in this context, in 1865, Johnson is an advocate of the 13th Amendment. He wants slavery to end. So he's carrying out the legacy of Lincoln in that sense. But Johnson thinks that that's it. That's the end. That is the revolution. And that is a great revolution, there's no doubt. Ending slavery is profoundly significant. Let's not lose sight of that. But Andrew Johnson thinks that that's the end of it. So we can end slavery, so people can no longer be owned and sold and bought and all of that by other people. But it doesn't necessarily mean that those people who had previously been held as slaves have any rights, according to Johnson. Johnson is not interested in civil rights. Johnson thinks that the revolution has ended, but African Americans think that the revolution has just begun. And that's what they're arguing, right? So the revolution is just beginning. And so what happens then in the summer and fall of 1865 is Johnson is trying to reconstruct the Union, and he's asked all of the former rebel states to hold constitutional conventions, to write new constitutions where they will outlaw slavery, they will say that they will no longer secede, and they will cancel the debts of the Confederacy. That's all that he's asking them to do. Well, at the same time that those gatherings are taking place in the southern states, African Americans are holding their own conventions in the southern states. Free people, those who are being freed by emancipation, are now meeting to talk about citizenship and rights. And in our own state of Tennessee, the Reverend James D. Lynch puts it this way in August of 1865. We have met here to impress upon the white men of Tennessee, of the United States, and of the world that we are part and parcel of the American Republic. That's a claim of citizenship, because citizenship, when it comes down to it, is all about belonging. And Lynch is saying we belong. It's that same language that we saw earlier. Here were we born, right? We belong, he's saying. We're not going anywhere. And we're going to claim all of those rights that are ours. Similarly, Sergeant Henry J. Maxwell, who had served in Memphis as a soldier in the Civil War and had been stationed at Fort Pickering, which was basically located on the Mississippi River in downtown Memphis, puts it this way, 1865, at that very same gathering in August, quote, "We want the rights guaranteed by the infinite architect. For these rights we labor, for them we will die. We have gained one. The uniform is its badge. We want 2 more boxes besides the cartridge box, the ballot and the jury box. We shall gain them. Let us work faithfully unto that end." Right? We have fought. We've gained the cartridge box. We are men. We have fought valiantly as soldiers. Because of that, we want the ballot and the jury box. Right? We want the right to vote and the right to serve on juries. All of these rights, civil rights, political rights, the full panoply of rights that are given to us by, as he puts it, the infinite architect. These are rights that come from God, he's arguing. Basic rights, fundamental rights, rights that are due to all men, he's arguing. So this is Maxwell then in 1865. And in September of 1865, just a month later, black leaders formed the National Equal Rights League, and they gathered in Cleveland, criticizing President Andrew Johnson and calling for an amendment to the Constitution that would prohibit any legislation, quote, against any civilized portion of the inhabitants, native born or naturalized, on account of race or color. Basically, what they're arguing for is an amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee that black people would have the same rights as white people. Right? Well, the following year, in 1866, Congress responds. Now, understand that by this time there are many white allies in Congress, members of the Republican Party, who think now that the war is over, in order to prevent another secessionist movement in the South, and in order to build up a base of loyal voters in the South, and in order to protect the rights of those who had previously been held as slaves, they are arguing now for genuine civil rights under federal law. And so in 1866, Congress passes the first Civil Rights Act in the history of the United States. It is, of course, called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And it spells out those rights of citizens after it says that all people born in this country are citizens. So in 1866, under this Civil Rights Act, we have the first statement of birthright citizenship. All those ambiguities that we had talked about at the time of the founding are starting to be resolved. Black constitutionalism has helped to shape this, right? Black constitutionalism has made a difference. The other thing that makes a difference, especially in moving from a federal statute like the Civil Rights Act of 1866 to finally a 14th Amendment, which will soon be ratified, is what happened in my own city of Memphis in May of 1866, and that is the Memphis Massacre. For 3 days in 1866, in early May, white mobs indiscriminately murdered African Americans in the streets of Memphis, men, women, and children. 46 African Americans were killed in 3 days of violence. At least 100 homes, businesses, and churches were burned. Others were wounded. It was a massacre. 3 days in Memphis in 1866. Congress is watching and takes note of this violence and says, we have to do more than simply pass a federal statute protecting black civil rights. We need to pass an amendment to the Constitution. In the arguments over the 14th Amendment, in fact, Charles Sumner, one of the strongest advocates for the 14th Amendment, makes mention of the screams and groans in Memphis. He's saying we have to pass this legislation to honor the victims of this massacre in Memphis. And so it happens. In 1866, Congress passes a 14th Amendment. Now, it will take longer and it will be a lot more complicated for this to be ratified by the states. Maybe we'll talk about that also. But look at this language. And this is kind of the capstone here, right? Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. A few things there to point out. One is note that the framers of the 14th Amendment feared that states like Tennessee or Georgia or South Carolina or Mississippi, that states were a threat to these civil rights. And so for the first time, what's happened here is that the framers of this amendment have said we need to protect individual liberties from infringement by states. No state shall do these things. That was revolutionary at the time, because if you look at the Bill of Rights, of course, the first words of the First Amendment are Congress shall make no law. It was an effort to try to interfere with the powers of Congress, to try to limit those powers. This is an effort to try to limit the powers of states. Very significant. But also see three phrases here that stand out. Privileges and immunities, due process, and equal protection. Privileges and immunities and due process came from other parts of the Constitution. They're working with existing materials. So they take the privileges and immunities language from Article 4 of the Constitution, which I mentioned earlier, that African Americans said that Taney's ruling in Dred Scott had violated that. So they take that language from Article 4. The due process language is from the Fifth Amendment. So the only thing that's new in the 14th Amendment, so the only brand new phrase that doesn't show up anywhere else in the constitutional text is equal protection of the laws. And that notion, arguably, harkens back to the Declaration of Independence. It harkens back to the black constitutional argument. It harkens back to just a few years before when African Americans are organizing in order to say that the application of the law needs to be equal, white and black. And so that phrase is a significant one. That's the primary portion of the 14th Amendment that stands out as new or in some way different. And if you look, interestingly, at the subsequent history of the Constitution, it is that phrase that has proved most significant of all in terms of expanding rights. Now, as I said, it would take a few more years for this to be ratified. It would take until 1868 and military reconstruction, but it is ultimately ratified. There's a 14th Amendment, right? So let's go back to where we started. Right? From the start, African Americans had claimed their share of the American heritage of liberty. You remember Absalom Jones? Beseech, we are men. We are men. Our rights are fundamental. They come from God. All men are created equal. That language of Jefferson, that's picked up by James Forten. And it applies, Forten argued, to people of all races, right? And African Americans are arguing that they are persons and citizens, therefore, under the Constitution, Article 4. Persons and citizens, they are arguing, are the same thing. Finally, they're arguing that their loyalty to the federal union and their service in the U.S. military during the Civil War, right, entitle them to citizenship. And finally, their birth in the United States. Here were we born. That too is essential to citizenship. So once again, understand that nothing is inevitable in history. Nothing is foreordained. What happened during and right after the Civil War was a fundamental revolution and transformation that did not have to happen. Freedom was followed by citizenship and civil rights. And note the profound nature of the shift from a political order that focused on the rights of slaveholders, in 1857 and 1859, to, by 1868, a political and a constitutional order that focuses on the rights of people who previously had been understood as property owned by others. That was a significant shift, a shift then from an understanding of property rights to human rights. It shapes our modern understanding of rights. And it was African Americans who, through their efforts, pushed and claimed these rights over and over. These rights weren't simply given to them, they were claimed on the part of African Americans, starting with Absalom Jones as early as the late 18th century. So, thank you all very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Come on, don't be shy. This is the Honors College.
I know you have questions.
Let me ask you one, because it may actually contradict what you said. How about the contract clause cases in terms of striking down legislation on behalf of rights prior to Dred Scott? Think they would count? Dartmouth College, for example?
It's a fair point. Right, so I'm making a claim here in terms of our modern understanding of human rights. I think that certainly we could think of the contract clause cases as protecting other forms of property rights. It is a fair point, but part of what I'm trying to do is sort of think about the Bill of Rights. And so the first time that the Bill of Rights, and I probably should have clarified that, but the first time that the Bill of Rights is ever used to strike down any act of Congress is the use by Tawney of the Fifth Amendment in 1857 to protect the rights of slaveholders. And that ought to strike you as really, really interesting, just in terms of the evolution of the history of the Bill of Rights. That's how the Bill of Rights was used in 1857. Excellent point, though, Dr. Pond. Thank you. Yes?
Well, what was the influence of some of the anti-slavery movements that were going on, like in Great Britain in the early 1800s? Did that have any influence on some of what was going on in the U.S.?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't think this has been studied to the extent that it should be. I think you can see, certainly in the late 18th century, a transatlantic movement in opposition to the slave trade, first of all. And that starts in Britain. There's a wonderful book on this by Adam Hochschild called Bury the Chains. And it's a big book, but it's worth the read because he basically tries to chronicle this whole movement in Britain from the founding of the first anti-slavery society in England in 1787, which is a gathering of a dozen men in a print shop, mostly Quakers and evangelical Anglicans and other folks, up through the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, which happens in the early 1830s. So there has been some work on the late 18th century, and I would argue that there are a lot of connections there between the movement to end the slave trade in Britain and the first emancipation movement in this country, which is in the northern states, which happens in the 1770s and 1780s. Beyond that, I don't think that we know enough about the connections between between British anti-slavery activists and abolitionists in this country in the 1820s and 1830s, for example. So I think it's a very good question. I just don't know that we know enough about that at this point. But it's something that we ought to explore more. I understand that there's a book that's just out called The Slave's Cause that I think tries to deal with this. I have not read it yet, but it's an excellent point. Yes?
You mentioned the sort of controversial historical nature of Andrew Johnson's legacy. Could you explain a little bit about both sides of that debate for the audience?
Well, and there's probably someone in the audience who's more qualified to do that, but sure. So Johnson is in some ways a very significant figure who is due a certain amount of credit for carrying out Lincoln's policy of pushing for the 13th Amendment. And if you think about Johnson's life, he's poor, he's a tailor, he owns a small number of slaves, he ends up liberating them and being an advocate of the 13th Amendment. So if you just sort of looked at that, you could say Johnson undergoes a significant sort of transformation. He leads the abolition revolution. This is how Johnson puts it. He thinks this is the greatest thing that he's done. And he wonders why, in his letters and his speeches in 1865 and 66, that he's not getting credit for this. He doesn't understand that there's so much more going on around him that history is passing him by. And he has this very limited view of what could and should happen. So that the turning point arguably is with his veto of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And some would put it earlier, but probably what happens is if you look at Johnson's veto message, it's very clear that he can only think of African Americans in terms of the context of, as he puts it, capital and labor. He sees African Americans as laborers, as this labor force. He's very sympathetic to white Southerners, even though his entire political life he's been hostile to wealthy planters because he was a poor white man in eastern Tennessee who really was not part of the planter aristocracy at all. But he ends up sort of being the sort of champion of white Southerners and trying to make the argument that we need to keep things how they are when it comes to the races, with kind of whites having all the economic power and African Americans kind of providing all of the labor. So I mean, all that then is simply to say, yes, I mean, you should give Johnson some credit for not digging in his heels and all of a sudden saying, we're not going to ratify the 13th Amendment. So, I mean, he obviously did not do that, which is good. So you want to give him a little bit of credit. But at the same time, he was ill-suited to the moment. He was very racially prejudiced. He had a very strong notion of states' rights and really was kind of the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time, I would argue. And to say that in Tennessee, maybe there's somewhat of a risk there. If you actually go to Greenville and see the National Historic Site there, it's probably a little bit more pro-Johnson than the interpretation that I just gave. Maybe there's someone in the room from Greenville, from the site, who could speak to that, but I don't. Yeah, Dan.
Well, in Johnson's birthday, his 200th anniversary, his birthday was in 2008, and we brought Eric Huebner in to speak in Greenville. Now, Eric Huebner is our leading scholar of the Reconstruction period. And he was harsher on Johnson than you just were. So you would not be run out of town in Greenville. Okay. They had a very healthy debate that time. So, I mean, people realize that Johnson is this sort of conflicted figure now in history up there. But in that region, they do protect him because he was a Unionist. And East Tennesseans can feel quite strongly that they were never for the Confederacy or the Civil War, and they don't like to be tagged as Confederates because they see that they never were.
Right. And I mean, I'll just add about Johnson. It's always been interesting to me that that our supposedly greatest president and our supposedly worst president are back to back, and that the greatest president arguably selected or accepted the nomination of Johnson as his vice president, and Lincoln gets none of the blame for that, which is interesting, I think. And I don't even know if there's ever been a book written about Lincoln and Johnson, but I think that's an interesting study that needs to be done because we always treat them separately, yet if you read Johnson's speeches and letters in 65 and 66, he thinks he's really carrying out Lincoln's work. He says this over and over again. And he says, I'm carrying out the work of my lamented predecessor. It's so sad that he was killed, but I am carrying out his legacy. And to Johnson's credit, most of Lincoln's cabinet is still there for a while anyway. And so all of those people that we associate with the greatness of Abraham Lincoln, especially Seward, were part of Johnson's cabinet too. So you have to wonder, I mean, about that whole question of continuity and whether you can really separate them like we tend to do as the best president and the worst president. It's just my thoughts on that, just random thoughts about Johnson and Lincoln.
We have maybe one more question.
Yes. The Haitian slave revolt, though it was successful, is said to have intensified slavery in Cuba and Brazil. What effect did the Civil War and freeing the slaves have on Cuba and Brazil?
I don't know. I mean, I know obviously that slavery lasts longer in those places, and what emancipation doesn't come to Brazil until, what, 1888? So it's actually quite a bit longer. You know, I think the other interesting thing there is that former Confederates see these places as welcoming. This is where thousands of Southerners end up, is in Brazil. So in that sense, they see a society that is similar to their own and want to try to continue that. But not knowing very much about the histories of those countries, I can't really comment on the actual impact that what happens in the U.S. has on those places. It's an excellent question, and sort of going back to the earlier question about abolition, I mean, I still think there is a great more work to be done about the global context of all of this, and I know some folks are working on this already, but putting the Civil War in the United States into a broader context is certainly a very worthy sort of enterprise.
I want to thank MP Engage for helping us sponsor this, and thank Dr. Huebner again. Let's give him another hand. And